Hello and welcome to the next JavaScript HTML5 game development tutorial number 8. In this tutorial we'll cover keyboard controls, and this is Tigris. Welcome to my new tutorial. And so this is what we're going to cover in this tutorial, but there's one more thing that I would like to show you, and that is because we are dealing with key events here, we need to be aware of something called ASCII code table. And basically there isn't an easy way in JavaScript to simply say up or down arrow, but all of the keys actually have codes and they're not very easy to figure out. So we do need to have some kind of a lookup table, and basically that's what it is. These are by far not all ASCII codes. I only singled out the ones that are important when it comes to video games. So we have here enter, the arrow keys, escape, spacebar of course, tab, shift, some of the other ones in yellow, not as important, WSAD controls, and some other common game controls, which is ZX. Sometimes games use that part of the keyboard for jumping or firing something. And of course the regular keys 0 and 1 through 9 have these codes, F1, F12, for some kind of special functionality, maybe saving or loading levels, I don't know. Some of the key codes change with the browser or operating system or even keyboard layout. So some of these keys may not work in your setup, whatever it is, but for the most part, if you're using Chrome or Firefox, it should probably good enough that you can use this jQuery function to figure out what the event.keyCode is for that key that you just pressed. So if you just copy and paste somewhere in your JavaScript this part of the code right here and pop open the Chrome console, and you will see exactly the code for the key that you're currently pressing. So in addition to all of these, you can use this to print out the code for any currently pressed key. So this way you can find out yourself what that key is. But for the most part, this will work in Chrome and some other standard browsers. So now that we got this out of the way, we can continue with the code part of this tutorial. But before we write our own keyboard's control code from scratch, I want to show you an older demo that I have developed, and we'll briefly go over the code here, and once we're finished we'll simply go back into our tutorial series base code and write the keyboard controls from absolute scratch. But first let's take a look at this demo. What you're seeing on the screen right now is one of my older games from a few months ago, and this is the best example of keyboard controls that I have so far, so that's why I'm using this as an example. Although we'll return back to our original smaller demo. There's collision detection already implemented, and that is one of the subjects for our future tutorials. But what I want you to see here is, let's cover this gap with a tile. I want you to see that this character is controlled by the keyboard right now, and there's a small console here indicating what's happening, and there is a way to control it with the Xbox joystick, but again, that's for our future tutorials. And here I'm simply controlling a character on this map. And because the controls are implemented already, I'll simply go into the source code for this game and grab the latest source code for the keyboard events, and we'll take a look at that, and then I'll show you, and I will write everything from scratch. I think that's a good idea because we need to do that in order to see what the process is like, rather than just having my existing code shown to you without any explanation. So my goal with this tutorial is to show you how to create your own controls. Not only that, but also understand them and how they work, so you can be more comfortable implementing them in your own games. So I'm going to stop the demo right now by going into the view source. And again, this is an older engine, and it's pretty much complete compared to what we're doing here in this tutorial. And there's a bunch of code here, as you can see. But one thing I want you to notice is that there's so many different libraries already implemented. And of course, all of this is going to be included in our future tutorials in terms of explanations. There's a collision.js file, there's tile, there's controls, which is the subject of this tutorial, there's sound, there's loading, special effects, the game, the world, 2D functions, and everything. All of this is already done here. There's one for weapons. But the point here is that we want to go into the controls, which is the most developed JavaScript controls file that I have so far up to date, and this is what we're going to use for our tutorial. And as you can see, here's a flashback to our ASCII codes. What we usually do is we define JavaScript variable and assign that ASCII code from the table that we saw previously. So we would do that. Remember, this is controls.js file. Then I have some keys mapped for the Xbox joystick, which is, again, not covered in this tutorial, but probably in the next one after the mouse controls. Here we'll also define some basic JavaScript variables. But here's the core. I want you to ignore all of this for now. Here's the core. We need to attach one event, which is keydown. And here's where we actually track all of these ASCII codes that we have determined earlier. There's some of the stuff that we're probably not going to do, which is outputting the key event into our custom console, as you've seen right here on this left hand side. So that's what that code is responsible for, and we're probably not going to do that in this tutorial. So I only want you to notice that there are some key states changes happening here. And the second set of events is key up. So this one was key down, so that's for key being pressed down. The second set, it goes over the same exact key codes, but this time the event is key up. So I need to mention that we need both, and it's basically a copy of the same thing. And obviously in this event, when the key is being released, we're going to set the state to false, which was previously set to true in our first set of events, which was the key down. So key down sets the state of each key to true, and the key up event sets it to false. And so that was a bird's eye view of our control file. In this example, we're going to go back into our tutorial code to write the controls file from scratch, and this way we'll see exactly how it's done in JavaScript. Looking back at our ASCII code table for a second, we see that left arrow is 37. So keeping that in mind, let's go back to our code. The first thing I want to do here in our engine is to add a new file, and this file will be called keyboard.js, and it's responsible for keyboard controls. going to make the font a little bigger here. And as we have just found out from the previous slide, the key code for the left in ASCII is 37. Now, in exactly the same way, we can look up the code for right arrow, which is 39. And going back to our code, so that's the first step that we're going to do. And if you need to add more keys, simply add them in the same way. For example, key up equals, again, we're going to look up in our table, and up arrow is 38. And I'll just add the other one. Remaining down is 40. So that's what we do here, 40. So we have just defined the arrow keys on the keyboard in terms of ASCII codes, and that's our first step. Now we need to actually attach the keyboard events, and for that purpose we're going to use jQuery because it's probably the easiest and most browser compatible. We need to have some kind of a function that initializes keyboard controls once. It will simply attach the up and down press events for each key that we're looking for. And usually I create initialize keyboard function, and within that function is where I attach those events. In the query, document object is a predefined object that we can use in JavaScript to attach events to. So we can attach keyboard events to separate elements, but when you attach keyboard events to the document object, it basically means all elements on the page, the entire HTML document. And that's probably what we're looking for when it comes to video game controls. And so the first event that we're going to attach is called keydown, and it has a nameless function that takes an event argument, and we just wrap it up like this. And basically here we will determine which keys we need to track, and these are the keys that we have determined here. For now it's just the arrows, but for our demo purposes that's more than enough. So let's try and track the first key. And the way we do it is this event passes the event object into this function. So we need to check if one of the members of this event object equals one of those ASCII codes, because that's what the key code property will carry in this event. And it could be one of the ones that we have defined earlier, for example, key left. So this is exactly how we track the left arrow on the keyboard. And all other ones are done in exactly the same way. For example, you would do something like this for right. You would do something like this for up, and you get the idea. And basically this is the entire mechanism of how you would add your controls to the game. But also remember that this is only the first set of events, and this is key down. But in video games it's useful to have both, when the key is pressed down and then another one when it's pressed up. So I'm doing exactly the same thing. What I did was I copied this code, I pasted it here, and changed the event to key up. So what this means is that now we have two sets of events. When the key is pressed down, and remember, it could still be held down, and the key up hasn't fired yet. but we need to implement some kind of a mechanism here so that the native JavaScript keyboard typing mechanism doesn't fire, because that would mean that multiple events would be fired at a certain interval. And we want to prevent that from happening, because usually when the key is pressed up, then we want the player to continue moving up regardless of how many times that event continues to fire. And for that reason, we need to establish our own set of states. And that's where the state variable comes into play. And usually I simply call it var kState. And this kState variable is going to be an array of values rather than just one value. And so because we have 4 keys right now, I'm going to create 4 states for each key. Now here we're not really naming any of these keys by name in this array, but we do need to mentally draw the link. In other words, let's say the left key will be array at index 0, the right key will be array at index 1, will be index 2, and key down will be located at index 3. So 0, 1, 2, 3 for all of these controls. So that's how we will mentally map these two. And if you just memorize that for each key you have each state, and usually they come in the same order, left, right, up, down. So these are the states that will be responsible for that. And having said that, within each event closure here, we can do something like this. When key is down, we set it to true. Remember, 0 is left. You can map it in your own way later, but this is the basic principle. And we really don't have to go farther than that to implement any additional code to make it look more visually readable. But the principle is the same. kState 0 here is true for the key down event, and for the key up it's the same thing, except it's false, because once the key goes up we want to set the state to false. So this is the basic structure of keyboard controls, and we have just successfully implemented the arrow controls. And one last thing I would like to mention is that although we're using all of these events, notice that in our game loop, which is this code right here, within the set interval, where we are drawing those dog sprites. Let's go back for a second to keyboard.js. Notice that in that loop that we just saw, we will not touch directly the key events anymore. We'll simply check for whether the kState array contains a true or false value. And that not only makes it more convenient for us to control our code along with the characters on the screen in the game that will control, but also eliminate the need to ever go back to anything as obscure as JavaScript keyboard keycode events. So from now on, we'll simply check the kState array, and if the value is true within here, within our loop, then that usually means that the key is pressed in that frame. So this is a pretty solid way of constructing a basic arrow controls for our game. What you're seeing here is absolutely the minimum code to control our game characters, and we're going to keep that in mind and move on to the next section of this tutorial. Sometimes in our game we want to implement the shift key, because often when shift key is pressed, something else should take place when another key is pressed down together. And for that reason, what I usually do, I create variable is shift, and I initially set it to false. And then in our keyboard events at the top, maybe here, if keyCode equals, and the shift ASCII code is 16. So if we have shift, we can take this variable and set it to true on keydown. And I'm going to copy that and paste it into our second set of events and turn it into false. So what this means, from now on in our game loop, if this variable is set to true, then we can be sure that the shift key is pressed down, and then we can combine it with different states. For example, just to give you a brief example here, if k state 0, which is the left arrow, and is shift, so a statement such as this would basically indicate if the left arrow is being pressed and the shift key is pressed down, then do something here. Of course, this is not the part of the event, this is just an example, but you get the idea of how to use it now. And of course, I'm sure you understand that that was an example that would be used in our main loop somewhere out here and not in the actual document keydown event. That was just an example. And the whole point of creating this initialize keyboard function is to actually hide all of these keydown and keyup events so that we never have to deal with them again directly. And the only thing that we will work with is the k-state array from our main game loop. And so a quick example of that would be, let's go back to our main engine and let's add keyboard controls somewhere here, keyboard.js. So from now on, we have access to the keyboard file which is created, and right here where we initialize context, let's call initialize keyboard function that we have just created. This will attach all of the events that we have just constructed. And now let's just add some variables here just for demo purpose and name them dog x, which is 64, dog y. This is the initial position of our sprite, dog x and dog y, and we'll plug it into our older sprite here, dog y. So now the dog is located at arbitrary x and y coordinates that we can control with the keyboard. Notice that the keyboard controls are initialized and our states are ready to be worked with right within our game loop. And remember, that was the key state array, and the 0 was responsible for left arrow. So we can check it right here. If k state, we would move the dog minus I don't know, 1. Let's save that and try that out. So I'm going to refresh the browser here, and I'm going to press the left arrow key now. As you can see, the dog is moving away. So in the same way, we can copy and paste it here. You can write a small note that this is left arrow, right arrow. And of course, the dog x coordinate needs to be increased in this case. So I'm going to resave that, refresh the browser again, and here I am actually walking the dog left and right. There's a scroll bar action going on that we don't really need, so I'm going to increase this a little. But the point is, I'm using, again, it's happening. What about this? The point is, I'm using my arrow keys right now, left and right, to control the dog. It's being animated. We're going to fix that up a little bit in the next step, and we'll have a full-blown controllable dog sprite. at this point, what I would like to do is, remember how we had utility.js function where we'll just keep adding all kinds of random utility functions that probably have little to do with game development itself. And maybe there will be something like disable scroll bars. And in this function, we'll just write some raw JavaScript code to disable the scroll bar, because as you have seen, it really gets in the way. And this will hide it for Chrome and Firefox. And of course, IE is always a little more stubborn than that, and we need to have a special way just for IE to do everything that all other browsers are doing with standard code. And now that we have this function, we can go ahead and go into the main loop, into the main game file, and add it here, disable scroll bars. I'm going to save this and refresh, make this smaller, and refresh the browser once again. And as you can see, now the scroll bar is not getting in the way, and the dog is being controlled just fine. Now, for the sake of being complete, I'll just continue adding here this code for directions on the vertical axis. And this would be, as far as I remember, up. This one would be down, and the state 0, 1, 2, 3. And here we're working with vertical coordinates, so I'll change that around a little bit. We can probably even do something like this to make it appear cleaner and shorter, and do the same for these two. And as you can see, we have 4 directional movement for the dog sprite. I'll refresh that, refresh in the browser, and as you can see, we can freely control the dog now on all 2 axes, X and Y. And that's the basics of controls for a single sprite. Now, I want to do something that will help us a lot in the long run in terms of code readability. Right now, kstate 0, it really doesn't sound very readable, and we always have to use these comments that I would rather not use. So in order to do that, first, what I'm going to do is I'm going to rename the kstate array to simply say key. And I'll do it like that. And then I'll go back into our keyboard and do the same here. So just rename all instances of kstate. We're just renaming the variable right now, nothing else. And first of all, this step alone is going to make it much more readable, but I'm going to take it a little farther and do the following. Remember how in our sprite object file, we determine the object using the function in JavaScript, because that makes the sprite name actually a constructor. So we're going to do the same thing for the key. And I've mentioned this before in my tutorials, that creating objects in JavaScript to accomplish one specific task, for example, to create a sprite, is significantly convenient and makes programming games a lot more fun rather than just typing everything manually. And so I'll go back to our keyboard.js file, and at the very top here, instead of sprite, I'll just say key, and rather keyboard. And I'll create this object, and within this object here, I'll determine some variables. And I'm going to do it in this way. Using the this keyword, I'm going to create left arrow, and I'll just say false for now. Then I'll say right arrow, false, up arrow, false, down arrow, false. So I encourage you to become a little bit of a code designer and start using object constructors a little more than you usually do. What I'm going to do here now is I'm going to make this keyboard object global, and we will initialize it from within this function. But what we need to do is we need to first, we're going to erase this definition here, and instead we're going to define window key equals null at this point. And what this means is that really using Windows dot is exactly the same as using var key. The difference is that you're attaching it to the Windows main object. And in fact, all of these variables are attached to window object. But here we are force specifying it like this. And the reason for that is that we want to make sure that this object is defined this way and that it belongs to the window scope. And within our initialize keyboard function, we're going to refer to that same object here, and we're going to create a new keyboard object, which is what we have just made here. So in other words, we're going to create a global key object and initialize it within the initialize keyboard function. As you remember, initialize keyboard is the function that we're calling from our main game file from within document ready after the context has been created. And so at this point, the new keyboard object will be constructed, and we can start using it in our events. But there's one more thing that we need to change here, and that was the whole point, converting array index-based access. Now we can use directly these properties that look a lot cleaner to me. And so what we'll do is key left arrow, this one right arrow, this one up arrow, this one will be down arrow. And we need to replace the same things for this part. So it would be left arrow, right arrow, up arrow, and down arrow. So what we have just done here, and let's go back to our main file. Instead of using index-based parameters here, we can delete these comments, and it's so much cleaner and easier to use from now on. Right arrow, up arrow, and in the future we'll never have to write any comments, and this will be just readable straight from the code, which is something we all need to take care of in our code if we care about making it readable. So as you can see, this simplified dramatically our controls code, and it looks clean, and it just makes a lot more sense at this point to use it this way. I love simple things in my code, and I think I just found a way to simplify this even further. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to replace all instances of arrow with nothing with space, replace all. So this way we only have left, right, up, and down. That has successfully replaced it every instance. And we'll have to do the same thing here. Just erase those. And that looks even more cleaner than we just had a second ago. At this point, I'm going to go back into my keyboard.js file and define a few more keys. For example, WASD controls false, this A false, this S false. As you may know, these are very common controls on the left hand side of the keyboard, so we definitely need to take care of them. And here also we need to add our ASCII code for those same letters. Key down, and I need to go back and look it up again. WSAD is 87. S 83. A 65 and 68. So here we have 65. D is 68. And of course, now we just need to add them in our event. And I'll do it like this. W. Of course, this is going to be reflected here. I might make this a little shorter, like that. Actually, all of them, because I really love doing that and making my code short and readable. Now this is much cleaner and readable. I'll do the same for these ones. Okay, we have W here. D. Just change them around here. And grab these, copy and paste them in here, and of course change them all to false. And I think now we have a pretty readable blueprint for adding as many keys as we want. You will see this in the downloadable source code. So it's very intuitive. All you have to do is just add some definitions here first, then determine the ASCII codes and plug them into the two key down and key up events. And once you have that, basically you can go into your main game code loop and do something like this. Key W, do something that the W would do here, and SAD, exactly the same thing, SAD. And here you have not only arrow controls but also WSAD controls, and at this point it should definitely work just fine in your game. And I know that this tutorial is getting a little longer than my previous ones, but getting controls out of the way is pretty important. So after this, we can focus on actual game development. And as you can see, the dog is running around. Obviously, there's no collision detection, so we can walk on the water, you can say, with the dog. And it works as intended. There's one more engine utility task that I would like to do at this point, and I'm going to take this code, which is responsible for drawing the map. I'm going to cut it out of here, and I'm going to go into my world.js file. In this file here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a function called drawMap. And I'll simply copy and paste everything from the main game loop that we had there. And maybe shorten it like this. And then I'm going to call this function drawMap and go back into our main loop and simply paste it here. And let's refresh the browser. As you can see, it still works, but the point was cleaning up this space within our main loop. So all of our code is super clean. We draw the map, we have the controls, and then we draw some sprites. This gives us a really nice starting point for actually building our game. You have just watched another installment of game development tutorials by Tigris. That's me. If you want to be reminded when my next tutorial is out, you can do so by subscribing to my YouTube channel. This is usually done by clicking on the subscribe button right underneath this video. I appreciate everyone's time, and I'll see you in my next tutorial.